이번 강연은 알랙산더 마틴 교수님을 모시고 진행합니다. 강연에 앞서 알랙산더 마틴 교수님의 양력을 간단히 소개해드리도록 하겠습니다. 학력입니다. 2002년 시카고 콜ум비아 대학에서 학사를 받으시고 2013년 워싱턴 대학교에서 한국화를 전공하셨고 2016년 펜실베니아 대학교에서 역사학 석사, 그리고 2019년 같은 대학 펜실베니아 대학교에서 역사학 박사를 수여하셨습니다. 박사님께서는 조선 왕조 역사 중에서도 특히 한국 북부 국경 지역에서의 관료 구조에서 군사 역할에 대해 연구해 오셨습니다. 박사님께서는 잭슨 스쿨에서 남북한 근현대사로 석사를 받으셨고 워싱턴 대학에서 소천 학자로 재직 중에 계십니다. 그러면 정식으로 모시겠습니다. 인사해 주시면 감사하겠습니다. 알랙산더 마틴 교수입니다. 큰 박수로 와주시면 감사하겠습니다.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I would first like to start by saying thank you to General Counsel Kwan and Deputy General Counsel Hong for connecting me with the National Unification Advisory Council. And I want to thank the Council for inviting me for this presentation. Thank you also to Dr. Kang for her help, and Mr. Park also. Thank you for your aid in translating this presentation. So I just want to start by saying that, you know, as you heard, I'm not a scholar of modern North Korea. I have studied the northern region of Korea for much of my decade in academia. And 19th century Joseon dynasty is very different than the modern Koreas. So I am sure that, as I'm not a scholar of North Korea, I may make some mistakes in the nuances of North Korean history, and because we have such a short time. So I apologize for that, just as a caveat. But I hope that we will get some good discussion out of my talk.
그래서 마틴 교수님께서는 특별히 한반도의 북쪽 지역을 주로 연구하셨다고 합니다. 그리고 말씀드린 바대로 보시는 바대로 지금 마틴 교수님께서 쉐어하고자 하는 스크린을 저희가 못 보고 있기 때문에 이 부분을 테크니션 분들께서 픽스하려고 노력 중에 있는 걸로 알고 있습니다.
So the story of the modern Koreas that we know frequently begins at the end of World War II and the division of the peninsula. It was a national trauma, and it's one that few countries have experienced and none have endured for as long as Korea. But I believe that this longevity is something that should give us a pause to consider. Is this a function of geopolitics, of inertia, or of rhetoric? There have been moments in the recent past even where the geopolitical alignments suggested that there was an opportunity for greater integration of the two Koreas that unfortunately never materialized. The status quo itself is often very difficult to change. Inertia has its own designs. And finally, there's the problem with North Korean rhetoric about what South Korea represents, and that makes unification seem like something of a failure from the North Korean perspective, which I will discuss in a bit. And while I think that all of these can be a reason for the intractability of Korean unification, today I'm not intending to argue for any one of those above reasons. Rather, I want to linger on the length of the division and suggest that it is a function of more than just politics, and that this long period of disunity has furthered already existing divisions that will remain despite what appears to be the inevitability of some kind of unification. And today I want to point out what I see as some obstacles in uniting under a common cause as a peaceful country. And I want to offer first a short synopsis of the development of the nation of Korea.
두 개의 한국을 말씀드리기 위해서는 2차 세계대전을 말씀드릴 수밖에 없고요. 중단을 얘기하기 위해서는 분단 기간이 과연 얼마나 더 오래될 것인가를 말씀드릴 수밖에 없습니다. 이것은 지정학적 원인을 다룰 수밖에 없고 그동안 계속되어 온 관성과 남과 북이 서로 얘기해온 수사학에 대해서 얘기를 합니다. 그리고 마지막으로 잠깐 말씀드릴 것은 분열을 가져온 분단은 통일로 인해 쉽게 해결되지 않을 것이라는 것을 말씀드리겠습니다. 이것을 마지막으로 통역은 그만두기로 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
So, is the nation of Korea the result of a process of gradual weakening and the corruption of the old Chosun kingdom through a bureaucracy that was more inclined to steal from than support the people, and weak kings who were unable to rise to the challenge of Western intrusions at the end of the 19th century? It's not to say that Korea lacked have its fair share of perceptive thinkers like Chung Ya-gyong or Shin Se-ho or An Jung-gun, who respectively bemoaned the Joseon Kingdom's lack of interest in modernity or the weakness of its national spirit or blindness to the designs of international powers. But these thinkers strove to awaken the nation as to the challenges it faced, but ultimately Korea was betrayed by the decadent elites like Lee Wan-yong or corrupt and power-hungry upstarts like Song Byung-jun and Yoon Si-ho. The colonial period, though, saw rejuvenation of the national spirit in the March 1st movement and a recognition of the importance of the heritage of Korean culture. And these helped sustain the Korean people in the face of an increasingly harsh Japanese colonial depredations. And it allowed it to maintain the promise of a renewed Korea after liberation, despite dictatorships and war. Or is Korea the story of the slow awakening of the downtrodden masses of Chosun subjects who were oppressed by the elites, the Yangban, the Chungin, who were more interested in power and wealth than the betterment of the nation as a whole? The system of government in the Chosun Kingdom operated to keep the efforts of small entrepreneurs, traders, and merchants from challenging this status quo, while also locking peasants into long-term tenancy that extracted profits and wealth through heavy taxation. Rebellions arose from time to time that made peasants more aware of the injustices of the system until a critical mass arose, usually associated with the Tonghaks. But that was defeated by the intervention of imperial powers and a complicit Chosun regime. The ensuing colonial period was a continuation of this struggle of the masses, though some of the most important battlefields of this struggle were actually outside the peninsula against Imperial Japan and its accommodationists. The post-liberation years were a vindication of the struggle whose success was constantly challenged by politics and dictators, but the struggle and the country still endures. Of course, these are two interpretations of the progress of the nation, and they overlap in many ways. And in South Korea, as a more open democratic society, they exist on a continuum where you can find those who believe some or both of the theories and are now more tolerated. Though I think the general interpretation is probably closer to the first. But in North Korea, the latter narrative of struggle is the official history. And the deviations are met with hostility. I personally do not want to suggest that one or the other is better or more correct, and that's not my point today. But I want to analyze the issues that arise in the conflict of these narratives and the further differences in the historical development of the two states on the Han Peninsula. In the South Korean side, the national spirit sustains and unites the people of the peninsula in a recognition of similarity, whereas in the other, the struggle for the nation is the animating force. So in unification of these two states and these two ideas, for South Korea, national unity is an inevitable consequence of political unity because the people are the same, the one spirit. For North Korea, in the narrative of struggle, if national unity is seen as a South Korean-led affair, the failure of the struggle against the forces of imperialism and capitalism will call into question the very existence of the nation. And so if this were only a political question, adherence to socialism or capitalism, and it dated back only to the 1940s or 50s, I imagine it could be solved with education and exposure to South Korean success on the part of many North Koreans. However, I think that this conflict between narratives of what Korea represents has the potential to expose deeper currents of division that will not so easily be assuaged. So the two Koreas that we see today are politically a product of Cold War alignments and external choices, predominantly on the part of the United States, the Yusamgik, the military government. Leaders were extremely anti-communist in the post-war liberation era, and that made them distrust the local people's committees that arose to handle local concerns. And therefore, the Yusamgik threw its support behind the old colonial apparatus. And the colonial authorities were themselves a product of the late Chosun era. Right? They were the elites who had not really lost much status between the fall of the Chosun dynasty and into colonialism. And now in post-liberation era, they had kind of succeeded in maintaining some power. In the North, however, the People's Committees were perhaps a little bit more successful. And I want to suggest that the North unification may trace back to relationships that the North had between the rest of the peninsula from the 19th century or earlier. So the northern region that I'm defining here, made up of Hwanghae, Pyongan, and Hamgyong provinces, had a long history of being different and difference and separation from the Chosun kingdom. North Pyongan and Hamgyong provinces themselves were not fully incorporated into the kingdom, the Chosun kingdom, until the 15th and 16th centuries. The areas of Kangye along the Amnok River in the far north was abandoned for a number of years because it was difficult to administer, but it was not well integrated into the rest of the kingdom. And then the 6 garrisons in Hamgyong province, Musan, Hwaryong, Chongsong, Onsong, Gyeongwon, and Gyeonghung, were moved throughout the 16th century, further and further north up to the Tuman River. But before this time, the area was occupied by Jurchens. And as the Chosun government pushed north, the Jurchens were either assimilated or pushed out, and eventually these Jurchens would come back as conquerors in the Qing era, when they, in the Pyongjang, Cheongyo, Horan. And so the history of Jurchen involvement in the Chosun kingdom is very complicated, and I would love to talk more about it, but we won't get into that today. But both of these areas, Pyongan and Hamgyong, also served as places of exile for political enemies, criminals, undesirables. And the practice of exiling was so widespread that a Chosun official, Mokne Son, complained in the 17th century to King Sukjong that the population of the northern regions had been corrupted by this practice of exile so much that the people in that area could not be trusted to not to cross the border and engage in illegal activity. And the North consistently had illegal border crossings to smuggle goods like timber and ginseng. And this caused great consternation for officials who encouraged the leaders in the magistracies, the magistrates, to clamp down on illegal activity, but it was not very successful. The people who resided in the North were also known to favor the military arts. And according to Central Joseon officials, the northern regions had almost no culture at all. And the southern aristocrats, the Yangban, even claimed that the northern provinces did not have any Yangban at all. And so for these reasons and more, the people from these provinces who tried to enter the government by passing either the civil service or military examination experienced regional discrimination in obtaining any positions of authority in the government. So instead, the residents in these areas, especially in Pyongan, engaged in commerce and enterprise at a higher rate than the rest of the peninsula. And one of the main reasons for their interest in commerce was the massive diplomatic missions that would travel to and from Beijing rather frequently, at least once every 3 years and more on special occasions. These missions often had hundreds of people attached and required a network of merchants and traders who could provision the envoys, give them the rice that they would need, and also merchants attached themselves so that they would be able to trade when in Beijing to bring the newest trends and books from the center of the world of Beijing at that time. And that path that these envoy missions took went straight up through Pyongan province. And the great quantity of people moving so frequently through the region could not help but stir up this economic activity. And no other province really experienced anything similar during the Joseon period. The closest would be, there were semi-regular markets. In Pyongan, it was held on an island in the Amnok River across from Izu. And in Hamgyong, there were markets in Hwaeryong and a yearly market in Hwaeryong and a once every other year market in Gyeongwon. And those markets sometimes referred to as the horse markets because they were vital for providing cavalry horses for the special military units that defended the northern border, and also post horses for post office stations for the north. The primary trade good for horses was cattle. And the numbers were quite large in the 19th century. A few hundred Qing merchants showed up in some years. So all of this development happening in the northern region was mainly due to merchants and commerce. However, making your money by trading goods and using capital was frowned upon in the Joseon dynasty at the time because it was heavily influenced by Neo-Confucianism. And this Confucianism looked down on merchants specifically because they made their money off the labor of others. Like farmers, and they did not produce anything of value such as crops or products of the mind. However, northern elites themselves pointed out that this discrimination was doubly unfair because the north of the northern region of the Joseon dynasty actually had a strong claim to being part of the earliest history of civilization on the peninsula. And they noted that Pyongyang was the location of the tomb of Kija. Kija, an 11th century vassal of the Shang emperor. He was said to have been given a kingdom that he called Joseon by the Shang emperor, and that was located on the peninsula. And so he was credited with bringing Confucian civilization to Korea, and his tomb was found in Pyongyang. And not only was Confucian history tied to the north, but even the oldest native Korean kingdoms were tied to the area through Mount Baekdu. The area was supposedly the birthplace of Tangun, which I'm sure you're all familiar with as the legendary founder of another kingdom called Joseon. And the North Koreans, unfortunately, I can't see the PowerPoint, but the North Koreans built a mausoleum. I'm sure maybe some of you have seen a massive mausoleum to Tangun. And this this Joseon kingdom of Tangun was opposed to ancient Chinese dynasties, and so it's a much more native Korean kingdom. And so Mount Baekdu also had a geomantic source of enervating energy for the Korean people. So to the residents of the north, this was important reasons why they should not experience the discrimination and have pride in their region. And so the residents of the northern provinces, though, were cut off from almost any access to the markers of status and respect that elites in around Gyeonggi and in the southern provinces, especially Gyeongsang, enjoyed. And so this regional discrimination probably played a role in the residents' embrace of not only merchants and commerce, mercantilism and commerce, but also heterodox beliefs like Catholicism and other types of Christianity in the 19th century. Pyongyang was even called the Jerusalem of the East by missionaries because of the level of local belief. However, this regionalism was also at the core of rebellions like Hong Kyung-nae's rebellion in 1812, other uprisings against taxes and Catholic persecutions in Hwanghae and Pyongan especially. The Tonghaks also found fertile ground for their followers in the late 19th century. And they were mostly interested, though, in establishing local control of government, especially in tax collection and expenditures on schools and other service. So even the Donghaks were quite regional in what they wanted to do in North Korea, in the northern regions. And new theories of nationalism from scholars like Shin Se-ho and Choi Nam-sun in the early 20th century located the origin of the Korean people in and around northern Korea and into Manchuria. So the dynamics of the northern region were changing in the 19th century. Schools were growing, which meant that more northern residents were obtaining the education necessary for participating in government. Reforms like the Kabul reforms changed the nature of government and social relations, removing a number of yangban and elite privileges and opening space for many more types of people to be involved in running the nation. And though the military arts were often looked down on throughout the Joseon era, in the late 19th century, they began to recognize the importance of the military in being able to fend off the West and Western imperial powers. And so these opportunities meant that the North could be recognized for more than just their backwardness. And it lent themselves to changing the power dynamics between northern provinces and the center. And I believe, given time, these new relations between the different regions of the peninsula could be established, and the strengths of the northern regions would combine with the resources of the South and create a new modern nation that could participate on the international stage. And this would have been a beautiful flowering of Korea, but we know that this is not true because of the intervention of Japan and Japanese colonialism. Japanese colonialism rewrote all of the dynamics on the peninsula. And it was a universal experience on the peninsula, but not everyone experienced it the same way. Japanese colonial administration actually further exacerbated these regional differences that we see. In the north, they created more heavy industries, they built more factories that would be closer to the metals and resources in the northern regions, and also to support the Kwantung Army in Manchuria. While in the south, the administration focused on agricultural exploitation, and they exported so much rice that famine was a regular experience, despite the fertility of Cholla and southern Gyeongsang. So I imagine that this short history of the northern region is not very surprising. But I wanted to highlight these differences to reinforce the point that the two Koreas experienced divergent paths even before 1948. And for much of its time, the northern region's position was inferior to those of the central and southern provinces. And so if there was one Korea from the start of the 20th century, then these two paths would have been a common historical legacy, like those of the regional differences here in the United States. Think about California and Georgia. They have incredibly different paths to statehood, but they both have a common national heritage that until recently appeared to overcome some important divergences, especially things like slavery, which I think the difficulties of integration that America itself is having right now lends credence to the idea that the historical narratives that we tell ourselves play a major role in bringing unification and also can play a major role in stoking divisions. And one of the great things about regionalism is the effect of inspiring a sense of pride of place. Pride of place in local customs and traditions, something, in Korea, hamhung naengmyeon is, everyone loves that, and the beauty of Kumgang Mountains. And so these are national Korean ideas, of course, but they are also regionally located. And being able to kind of start that conversation on the region is an important aspect of bringing national unity. But in the immediate situation of unification, claiming these experiences as universally Korean without an appreciation of the distinctive regional character risks alienating the North Koreans in a unified Korea. Something similar in the US would be grits, because you can't make grits north of the Mason-Dixon or poke being made by non-Hawaiians. These can cause friction. And as you may have noticed, I speak of unification as a South Korean-led endeavor. I may be biased, and though this is itself problematic, right? Unification suggests a kind of a meeting of equals, but it's inevitable that South Korea will be the dominant partner of any unification, if only by population. But South Korea's greater wealth, their international experience, infrastructural development, all these things will mean that it is incumbent on South Korea as the major partner to be more sensitive to the concerns of North Koreans to avoid greater alienation. The change will undoubtedly be greater for North Koreans than South Koreans. And that alienation could be exacerbated by these historical divisions that I've outlined. And so the euphoria of unification will undoubtedly mask potential pitfalls of these differences for years. If East and West Germany are any guide, it took about a decade before disaffected East Germans started kind of recalling their East Germanness and causing problems for the unified government. And also around that time, that decade, there was a resurgence of nostalgia. And so I believe in a unified Korea, look for about a decade after a nostalgia for everything DPRK might come around. So if you're an investor, you should take note of that. But without a proper appreciation of the role of historical understanding in uniting modern nations, these divisions, they're just going to crop up sooner or later. And one problem I think is of great importance is the role of the late Joseon era in modern Korean history. So for North Korea, the dynasty marked the high point of elite exploitation of the masses. It was a feudal regime. It held back the forces of the downtrodden and oppressed. It stagnated in a mode of capital extraction that invited the abuse of Western powers. Now, in South Korea, the Joseon dynasty is not universally maligned, although I know some scholars would agree with what the characterization that I just made of the oppressiveness of the Joseon dynasty. And I think that's one of the beauties of open and democratic societies is the ability to argue those differences. But for all its faults, the Joseon dynasty did have kings like Yeongjo and Cheongjo, represented enlightened leadership and reform, while the learning of people like Tasan and other Shirhak scholars is as deep as any culture from the 18th and 19th centuries. But given the record of Joseon discrimination in the North and rhetoric about the northern provinces and the border region lacking in culture, there will probably be great resistance on the part of North Koreans to recognizing laudatory aspects of this narrative. And I think the underlying feeling of second-class citizenship could be reinforced in teaching on Joseon dynasty history. And so, that possibility should be addressed clearly and conscientiously. I imagine, though, that there wouldn't be a whole lot of historical materials still existing in the North, just because of the way that North Korea has not wanted to remember the past. Many of these historical documents and materials are lost, but I imagine that as a project of unification, finding and encouraging locals in North Korea to participate in discovering historical materials and making the project a joint project would be something that could inspire more interest in the time period. However, I think one of the greatest tensions will exist in more recent historical figures. So more recent mutual histories will also need to be reassessed in the light of a national unity. The North Korean experience is not an aberration. Right? As much as the creation of two political entities was an unnatural product and frequently cited as Cold War influenced experience, the North Koreans themselves, their experience is not unnatural. Right? They were never a puppet state or an illegitimate creation. So their experience is needs to be recognized. And I believe that the most sensitive issue will actually come with the legacy of Kim Il-sung. So Park Chung-hee is a very controversial figure, as we know, and Kim is no less so. But while South Korea has had the opportunity to reassess the legacies of its past in a democratic process, an open process, and a long process, they were able to reassess these legacies in a very open way. For North Korea, I don't imagine that there would be any process like this before unification. And so for unification to be a moment of healing, a sensitive treatment of the origins of the DPRK is important. Kim Il-sung has a legacy as an anti-Japanese nationalist, as much as someone like Kim Koo. But the North Korean cult of personality that developed around him will make it very difficult to embrace, for North Koreans to embrace South Korea, while at the same time laying blame for the divisions at the feet of Kim Il-sung. A more measured treatment that allows space for the complicated legacy of historical figures, something akin to the treatment of Park Chung-hee, will be an important project for a unified Korea. As a historian, I relish the nuance and ambiguity because it allows us to create vibrant tapestries of our past. But as a human, personally, I want to know who is right and which side is right. And seldom, though, is there a right or a wrong, as the controversies in America over the 1619 Project about slavery has shown just recently. And it's often in the political arena where passions get translated into policy. And that is where people most want to settle what is the right way to view history. And so luckily, I'm not a politician. So I don't intend to try to answer the right or wrong of Kim Il-sung's life and work. But I'm only pointing to the inherent problems that his legacy creates for a unified Korea. So many scholars and North Korea watchers assume that unification will happen with the collapse of the Kim regime. And if that does happen, I imagine that the North Koreans will blame the decline on the Kims. But I believe mostly Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un and Kim Il-sung's legacy will remain generally untarnished. And so the immediate post-war reality is that North Korea's greatest hero has now become a villain. And that kind of change will be very difficult to process. And so for North Korea, unification under South Korea would be seen as a bittersweet failure. At unification, Korean history will include two narratives of its modern creation. A Korean history that does not have a place for the North's heroes, even as tragic or flawed characters, will have a permanent subclass of former North Koreans. But recognizing that these two roots can form a stronger tree together will take sensitivity and empathy from the South Koreans, and that will go a long way toward integrating Korea without relegating one side to the failure of a national dream. And I'm sorry that I don't have more answers in my presentation and only have presented more questions. But I look forward to hearing from you and your questions. Thank you for listening.